And welcome to an introduction to sex trafficking, strategies for identifying children and youth at risk for or survivors of sex trafficking. This webinar is presented by IOFA, the International Organization for Adolescents, in collaboration with Courtney's House and Victim Rights Law Center on behalf of the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Violence Against Women. If you have any questions during or after this webinar, please reach out to IOFA via email at info@iofa.org, and we will be happy to assist you. My name is Allie Boak. I'm the co-founder and executive director of IOFA. IOFA has been working for more than 18 years to end the trafficking and exploitation of children and youth through innovative programming to empower and protect young people. IOFA, together with our partner Courtney's House, is the OVW training and technical assistance provider on issues relating to minor sex trafficking and the commercial sexual exploitation of children. And I'm very happy to be joined today by Tina Front. Tina is a survivor of minor sex trafficking and the commercial sexual exploitation of children and the founder and executive director of an amazing organization called Courtney's House. It's survivor-led and survivor-run drop-in center support system and training organization.
Thank you, Allie, and hello, everyone.
I'm also pleased to introduce Hema Sarang-Saminsky from the Victim Rights Law Center.
Thanks, Allie. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. Just to give some background on the Victim Rights Law Center, we are the first nonprofit law center in the nation solely dedicated to serving the needs of rape and sexual assault victims on civil legal services issues. We have been in service of victims of sexual violence since 2003, and we currently serve as the training and technical assistance provider for OVW LAV grantees. This information is probably new to many LAV grantees, and we're really excited to build our collective capacity to serve this particular population. So thank you so much, and we're excited to come together with all of you.
Thank you so much, Hema. We're really happy to partner with you on this, and we hope and expect it'll be the beginning of many joint training sessions. So thank you.
Thank you.
So what can you expect from the training today? The goal of the training is really to receive a comprehensive introduction to the issue of sex trafficking of children and youth. Specifically, as a result of this training, you should be able to understand and define what we mean by minor sex trafficking and the commercial sexual exploitation of children, which is called CSEC for short. You will learn why youth are vulnerable and targeted by human traffickers. And most importantly, you'll learn what red flags to look out for that might indicate if a child is at risk for or being trafficked. We're going to try to make it interesting for you today, and we will use some real case examples shared by Courtney's House, and you'll have the opportunity to identify potential survivors and learn about their potential social service and legal needs. Finally, and really importantly, you will learn what to do if you think you have identified a child or youth that may be trafficked, either in one of your programs or in some other aspect of your work. So today we're going to approach the issue of minor sex trafficking and CSEC from a human rights-based approach. So what does that mean and why do we do it? Trafficked persons who are served using a human rights-based approach tend to regain trust and safety and to more fully recover from this horrendous crime. I'm wondering, Tina, if you as a survivor can share with us just briefly from your perspective, what does it mean to address this issue from a human rights-based approach, especially when working with trafficked children and youth?
So at Courtney's House, everything we developed is based off of my life and what would have been the best way to receive services for me that I didn't. That's important because I think we're so careful about the language we use, which you should be, but we forget basic things. So at Courtney's House, we have to let them know that at the very beginning how empowered they are and how even our program is a choice and everything is presented to them as a choice. I think people get scared when things are presented so much as a choice because what if the person refuses to come into a program, which actually we don't see. So just remembering that everything they do can be a choice and presenting it to them that way.
Great. Thanks, Tina.
You're welcome.
When we talk about human rights approach, we also talk about the word survivor versus victim and making sure that we use empowering language. So we want to use empowering language like survivor and empower versus rescuing and saving people. It's also really important to know that we're really trying to get rid of the language child prostitute. There really is no such thing as a child prostitute. It's children who are exploited and abused. And one way I think that we can really promote this human rights-based approach is by changing our language. So
Yeah, and I think it's important for the survivors and a victim. So survivor can be also when they're on the street, they're surviving. If you empower them at hello, then they can tell you more how they're victimized.
great point. Thanks, Tina. So what do we mean by minor sex trafficking and the commercial sexual exploitation of children, CSEC? Before we can get into that, it's really important to understand just the general crime of human trafficking. So we have this chart here that outlines the three elements under the federal trafficking law in the United States, which is known as the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And there's three elements that must be present for the crime of human trafficking to occur. So the first element is what we call the process. It's basically getting someone under your control. You recruit them or you abduct them, you facilitate or transfer, harbor, or transport a person. You somehow get them under your control. The second element is means. So it's through force, fraud, or coercion. Force can be physical force. Fraud can be a contract or something where you think you're going to start one job and it's actually something else. And coercion can also be psychological coercion, threatening to harm a loved one or a child or someone close to a person where you're not even laying a finger on them, but you have very strong psychological control over them. And then the third element is the end. So a person has to be trafficked for the purpose of labor, services, or of a commercial sex act. These are the three elements. Now, when it comes to minors, which is anyone who's not yet attained their 18th birthday, you actually don't need that second box. You don't need to show force, fraud, or coercion according to the federal definition. But we go over this entire definition because in some states, for example, in New York, where I'm based, unfortunately, you still need to show force, fraud, or coercion with minors. Now I'm going to show you a true-false question on the next screen based on the information that I just gave you. So please use your polling buttons to show if you believe the following statement is true or false. Minor sex trafficking requires a city, state, or international boarding crossing. Is that true or false? Give everybody a minute to respond here. Okay, the results are coming in. And the answer is false. So if you look at this chart once again, it's important to note that under the first element, process, you have the words or. Recruiting or abducting or facilitating or transferring or harboring or transporting. You do not have to transport a person or move them over any type of border or crossing for it to be trafficking. You can actually traffic a child right in your own home without ever leaving. So we know that there's youth and children that are trafficked for labor trafficking, and there's also an overlap where children and youth are trafficked for both labor and sex. However, today we're really going to focus on minor sex trafficking and the commercial sexual exploitation of children and youth. But we did want to mention that there is a phenomenon as labor trafficking and that there is an overlap often. As you can see from looking at the bottom of this graphic, minor sex trafficking is when a child or youth who has not yet attained the age of 18 exchanges something of value for sex. As we move to the outer circle, we can see that minor sex trafficking is a part of CSEC, which we will call CSEC from here on out, commercial sexual exploitation of children. And then as we move even further to the outer circle, you will see that CSEC and minor sex trafficking are both forms of child abuse, which includes sexual, physical, emotional abuse, and or neglect. In the next segment, Tina's going to describe for us 4 different types of minor sex trafficking and CSEC that occurs.
So if you take a look at this, you will see the 4 types inside the U.S. of domestic sex trafficking will be pimp, gang, family, boys, and transgender. Now, the reason why the trafficking of minors can be broken down to 4, because each one has a different way that you enter, and each one actually has a different way, different language as well. Most of the time, people are in more than one situation. Each of these situations actually look different to us too. So survivors get in numerous trafficking situations. In some instances, another person, often a man or female, will connect with a younger person, a girl or a boy, and convince her that they have a unique relationship, right? A friendship, a love, or maybe it's their own family that is growing them into doing this. Over time, the relationship changes to one of the power and abuse, just like domestic violence, and very similar to that. And especially when it comes to family control, it can come in and look like it's child abuse when they're younger, but the right questions aren't asked to follow up with that. With this relationship is very different inside a gang controls relationship. It can be a boyfriend at first, or someone can go to a party and they can be set up and brought into the gangs. Minors are particularly vulnerable to gang activity as well. And family control, and I really want to kind of understand that 100% of our boys actually were family controlled first, and it came into the foster care system. And it sounded like, just like Ali was saying, child sexual abuse. But later, with the right questions, it was determined it was actually being sex trafficked. Some family members, including minor relatives, will exchange something of value with a child to engage in sexual activity. Some will pimp out the minor to others for profit. And I think that's a little tricky sometimes when they're young because you're not exactly sure that you see as a child the money exchange. So we'll get later into this and talk a little bit more about the questions to ask to determine this.
Great, thanks.
Just know that homelessness is one of the most common drives of trafficking where minor children are. So it can be either homeless or something else going on in the neighborhood or being involved in a foster care system. I think a lot of times people assume that we work with a lot of transgender population. And actually, since 2008, we may have had 4 or 5 transgender youth. But what we do have is a lot of boys who define as either just boys or define as gay, or don't define at all because they're so young. So just remembering not to pigeonhole so we can open it up to all. 63% of our population actually identifies as LGBTQ. That includes our girls in that population. So please remember that girls can also identify as LGBTQ as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Allie?
Tina. Okay, so time for another little quiz. True or false? Only foreign-born children and youth are victims of minor sex trafficking. Use your polling buttons to answer this question. Okay, so the answer is false. We got 100% correct answers on this one. Youth that were born and raised in the U.S. are victims of minor sex trafficking as well, as children and youth with green cards, permanent residence, or other forms of lawful immigration status. So really, the way to think about it is really any child or youth can become a victim of human trafficking. Now we're going to take a look at why children and youth are vulnerable to trafficking. We know from statistics from the U.S. State Department that nearly 50% of all trafficking cases worldwide are of children and youth under the age of 15. Tina, can you share with us from your experience running a drop-in center for trafficked youth, what makes children and youth targets of traffickers?
Yes, I think that we see many things. So we also have a lot of parents that refer their children, and they do see that many have left home sometimes. Sometimes you run from something or to somebody. So maybe there's someone they met behind the scenes that they didn't know about. One of the other ways that we can see in youth are at youth, I'm sorry, that are upset. So maybe there's something going on in the home. There's already violence in the home. Maybe they became homeless or in the foster care system. These are some of the things that make them vulnerable to being in a situation. 90% of all of our survivors, including myself, were sexually abused before the trafficking situation. So some of these other vulnerabilities could be present, especially with the boys as well.
Great, thanks, Tina. So this next slide shows some of the reasons why all youth are at risk of trafficking. So take a look at this list and see if you recognize any of these signs in yourself when you were a young person, in your children, or any of the children that you work with. We need to remember that youth are vulnerable just because of their age and that their brains are still developing. We know that the adolescent brain will perceive risks differently than we do as a result. So using the show of hands button, how many of you have children that are allowed to use the internet without you directly supervising them? Okay, so many of us. Our youth carry around in their pocket one of the biggest recruiting tools used by traffickers, their cell phones, where they have access to Instagram, Snapchat, and other programs. Now, Tina's going to talk briefly about some of the children that are at special risk. So we just talked about how all children, just by the fact of being minors, are at risk, but there are certain children that are at an elevated risk.
There are additional issues that can make you vulnerable to trafficking. The youth that I work with at the drop-in center in Courtney's house often have case histories that includes 1.6 million children run away from home each year. At Courtney's house, we don't say run away, so we say left home. 1 in 6 endangered runaways report the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. In 2012, were most likely sex trafficked. Think about that. 1 in 6 who run away. And what we actually see at Courtney's house are a few things, what Allison's talking about. Definitely online recruitment. But we also see that many of these traffickers are by their schools. They meet them by accident, right? Right by their school or right in their neighborhood at a McDonald's. A lot of our youth are foster care. So maybe that they don't like the housing that they're currently staying in, and it's not the type that they need. So these people also offer housing to them if they need it. And they also offer money, love, and support and that family that they're looking for.
Great, so now let's talk about how children and youth are recruited. And you can't forget that this is a business. Not only is it a business, it's a multi-billion-dollar business. So traffickers are very careful about who they scout out, how they select the children and youth that will be the most easy for them to control, who they target. Tina, can you talk a little bit about the different ways young people are recruited?
There are a few different ways if you take a look at this slide. One of them definitely is running away or kicked out the house. So maybe they're being kicked out because they identify as LGBT or they don't like the person inside the home. Maybe their parent married somebody, they're not treating them correctly. So by their family. I really want you to understand this happens all the time. So we have many youth that are actually sold by their family. They're recruited by their friends. So maybe they're just at a group home setting and they're recruited by other people inside the group home. Or maybe they're just one of their friends who just recently met a trafficker is bringing this other young girl to their house to meet them. Online happens a lot on Instagram, on Facebook, and if you work with youth, then you know that not many of them, the younger ones, are on Facebook as much. So it's definitely Snapchat and Instagram as well. Befriending them, having a boyfriend that could also be the same age or older. There can also be boyfriends inside the school that are also connected to trafficking. False employment. We are actually seeing a lot of false advertisements. So to be a model, to be inside of a dance crew or dancing as well. And then, of course, none of that is related to it and is trafficking. Kidnapping. I want you to think about kidnapping, that word, and then change your mind slightly. We're not talking about everyone's just grabbed up off the street and thrown into the van. What we're also talking about is a child cannot consent to get in a car with a grown adult. So it could be a different way of that sort of way of going with somebody and thinking this is a relationship and them forcing you into a trafficking situation, which was similar to my experience as well. And then, of course, promise of a better life is what we see a lot inside the foster care system, telling them they can provide for them better than foster care, a place to stay, things that they need, and be there and have that family. So these are some of these signs that we currently see all the time. Now, if you take a look at our next slide and you see the grooming process, I really want to bring home to you that, including myself and many of our youth, do not understand that they're in a grooming process. They do not see any of these signs. So, understanding that so you can walk them through the signs that they did not see is very important. Traffickers are deliberate when they choose youth to traffic. They are watching them, they are paying attention, but the child doesn't see that. Oftentimes, youth who demonstrate that they have a need that can be fulfilled is zeroed in by a trafficker. A need can be a lot of things, right? It can be attention, it can be caring, it can be a friend, it can be even a mother or a father figure, a romantic figure as well, or even just like somebody that's just looking out for them and just want to make sure that they okay. I think that's important because in my situation and what we're seeing with many youth, the trafficker did not have sex with them right away. So also being able to point these signs out. Traffickers focus on youth in desperate or unwanted situations, if they left home or if they're being abused in the home or again in the child welfare system. Even teens who may show anger and frustration toward their parents for now allowing them even some freedom they desire can also be a target. Any promises of false love or freedom or independence, family, and safety, these are all things that they may see. Maybe they're not all buying them items. Maybe they're promising them love, safety, and they're being there for them. The traffickers start by fulfilling promises to get the youth to trust them and to believe that they are truly someone who cares for them. Traffickers may normalize any prior abuse. So in my situation, I told the trafficker, in my situation, I was in foster care and then I was adopted. My trafficker told me that he grew up in foster care and he was adopted and their family gave him back after a year. This isn't true, but my fear was not having a family. So think about that and also pointing these small things out so the survivors can see it. It's also helpful in their recovery because this is a process that you don't normally see as much. Now, our next slide is how do youth become trapped? I think people ask this a lot. Well, think of it this way. When you don't see that you're being manipulated in a situation, sometimes it's too late to go, oh no, you're already in the situation. So you're so traumatized that you blame yourself. Now, once again, 90% of, like I told you, of all of our survivors were sexually abused. When you're sexually abused, you blame yourself anyway. So this is something that you're already doing, is blaming yourself. So now you believe that there's no way out. You're unaware that you're actually the victim of the crime. So you think that you did something wrong, that you went with this person, that this will be your fault. And they tell you that. Develop positive feelings toward the trafficker. So in the beginning, definitely develop positive feelings, thinking this is your boyfriend, is going to get better. You distrust authorities. So I grew up in an environment where police were not our friends in our neighborhood. So I was even told not to trust anyone, even the fire department. So a lot of our survivors feel the same way. They may try to protect the trafficker because you start to think of the things you liked about this person and say, well, no, well, maybe they're a good person and maybe they didn't know they were trafficking me. And that's really what trauma bond does. Maybe you do not know where they are, right? Because traffickers move a lot. Maybe you don't know exactly where you're always taken to. Fear of safety or family. Many of our youth say they don't come home because the trafficker tells them that something will happen to their family. So they actually think that staying away from your family is going to keep your family safe. So sometimes because of that, you protect the trafficker because you don't want any harm done to your family. If we take a look at our next slide and what the trauma bond really is. So we were just talking briefly about that trauma bond on there. The trauma bond can also be traffickers work a lot together, right? And so maybe there are many people around in that situation. And that is hard to break. You also built a family. It may have been a negative family, but that's a family that you have bond against. And maybe you look at abuse as love. So thinking about how the youth saw abuse in their own home before their trafficking situation is also very important because it even helps create a stronger bond to the victim and the predator than a healthy relationship would. In addition, the predator often keeps the victim isolated, and the feelings of shame and stigma associated with being forced into life. Similar to domestic violence, it's very similar. Also, 100% of our survivors, and including myself, after exiting their trafficking situation, usually get into a domestic violence situation after that because you have to break that trauma bond. This is dynamic. It can be very frustrating for service providers who are attempting to assist the survivor, not knowing exactly which behavior will cause and which reaction will get them engaged. Really kind of walking them through what abuse is, I find to really help.
Thanks, Tina.
Well, that will lead us to who are the traffickers, Allie? Thank you.
So I began my human trafficking work in Eastern Europe, and so I had this view that traffickers were Russian mafias, guys wearing black leather jackets standing outside of nightclubs, recruiting people for sex trafficking. And in the 18 years that I've been working on this issue, I've really come to understand that anyone can really be a trafficker, and you have to have a complete open mind about what a trafficker looks like, who they are, and where they come from. So a trafficker can be a man or a woman. They can be at any age, including children themselves. They could be of any ethnicity or race. Pimps are included in as a trafficker. They can be family members, intimate partners such as boyfriends, spouses, uncles, brothers, etc. They could be someone that you work for, your employer. They could be somebody that works with children and youth, such as teachers, coaches, Boy Scout leaders, church leaders, church members, etc. Or they could be complete strangers who specifically prey on a child and purposely try to meet them. One other trafficker category that's missing up here that's really important, particularly if you're in D.C. or New York, are diplomats. We have had a lot of cases where diplomats are also trafficking young people because maybe they have different laws in their own country and they don't see it as trafficking and they bring people with them or they recruit people here. So I want to move the presentation to looking at indicators and red flags of minor sex trafficking. This is really important to go over because it can be very challenging. As you can imagine, most of these kids are not jumping up and down saying, hey, I'm a victim of child trafficking, or I'm a victim of sex trafficking. Like Tina said, many of them blame themselves or think they brought this on themselves and don't realize that this is actually a crime and that they're being part of a business and that they are being so exploited. So we're going to spend some time on how you identify these young people. So this next slide shows some flags that an adult or a child who's being trafficked for sex could have. Jewelry or tattoos. Tattoos you can see also when it's recruiting for gangs. If a kid suddenly has money or a lot of cash or something that they usually couldn't afford, if you see kids with new jewelry or new sneakers or new clothing or new phones, that could be an indicator that they're somehow getting some money. If a young person is traveling to other towns or other cities or in larger cities to different parts of cities and you don't really know why they're traveling to those places. That could be an indicator that they're moving around, being moved around by a trafficker. If they own more than one cell phone, that could also be an indication that they have to be on call at all times for their trafficker. These signs can also be signs for another type of crime that's happening to youth. So it's not like if one of these indicators is present that means that a child is being trafficked, but we give you these signs just so you can have an idea of what to look for. And then it'll really, take a larger understanding of the situation to decide if something is going on, and we hope to provide more in-depth training on that in the future. But some other things to look for, if a child is constantly having some signs of injury, bruises, cuts, things like that. If they seem overly fearful or submissive, that could be a sign. If they won't look you in the eye, or they're very jumpy, or if they're constantly looking at their phone and because they need to answer it right away, if they get a call. If they don't know about the community they're living in. We had a case once where a young person was trafficked for California, and she didn't know where she was. She was wearing summer clothes. She didn't know anything about the local community. That could be a sign that they've been moved and that they're taken out of the place where they live. Mistrust of law enforcement, particularly if you have young people that come from other countries, as well as here in the United States. There's many communities where people just do not trust law enforcement, and the last place, like Tina was saying earlier, that they would go for help is the police or fire or first responders. Also, if you see young people that have fake IDs or claim to be an adult, that could be a sign. If they're missing school a lot or do poorly in school, there might be something else going on. Sleeping in school, we've had cases where a young person's working a lot at night, so they go to school because they want to get food. They want to eat, and so they do go to school, but they're constantly falling asleep because they're working all night. Inconsistent story may also be a sign that there's trafficking going on. And if they use some language referring to the life, that could also mean that they're trafficked. There's a lot of red flags, as you can see. Tina covered this before, but if they're hanging around with a much older boyfriend or girlfriend, that could be an indicator. If they're using street slang, which we just kind of talked about for the life, if they appear scared to a degree greater than the situation warrants, that could be a pretty good sign that something is going on. If you suspect that there is a domestic violence relationship, there's also often an overlap between domestic violence and human trafficking. A youth lying about their age, they could be instructed by the trafficker to say that they're older, that they're an adult when they're a child. If you work in a healthcare setting or a shelter or somewhere where somebody might be bringing in a child for services, if that person doesn't allow the child to answer on their own behalf and answers all the questions for them, that could be a sign that there's some sort of forced relationship going on there. And these kids often become very isolated. They become disconnected from their peer groups. They become disconnected from their social supports, from their family. So if a child has a big change in behavior of who they're hanging out with and kind of pulling away from supports that they had in the past, that could be a sign. And also, if a child or youth has multiple sexually transmitted infections or abortions, this could be a sign that they are a survivor of sex trafficking. Tina, do you want to add anything else to what I just went over?
I want to just quickly go back to some of the signs for gangs. So we talked about tattoos, but remember, to get a tattoo and be in a gang, that's pretty far along, right? You've been involved a few more months than then. So it's great to understand different colors. Like we notice, especially in Latin gangs, that a lot of our survivors all wear Converse, right? Purple is Los Locos, 18th Street Gang. And then red would be another gang, which would be MS-13. So like understanding your colors are different. They are going to wear the shoe color more. So that will tell you the change in what they're wearing. Their dresses will change with consistent gang colors before tattoos.
Great. Thanks, Tina. So this next slide has some indicators specific to child labor trafficking. And we thought it was important to go over this because, as we said before, there's often an overlap between child labor trafficking and sex trafficking. So again, if a child is missing a lot of school, if they're not allowed to leave the house, or they have to live in a specific part of the house, that may mean that they're being trafficked for labor. If they live with a host family or they're fearful of the people they live with or their employer, that's a sign. If there's kids that tell exactly the same story, if you have clients or you're interviewing potential victims, and even though you isolate them, they come in one after another and tell you exactly the same story, that means that they've been coached by their trafficker. What to say if they get arrested, or what to say if they're sent to Child Protective Services. So that could also be a sign that someone is controlling them. And remember, with labor trafficking, a child could be getting paid some money, and the same for sex trafficking, but they're not getting paid when it comes to labor trafficking what they're supposed to get paid, if it's a minimum wage situation, if the child's old enough to work. So it's not just that a child is never getting any money. As you remember, one of the red flags is that they actually have money on them, and that could be a sign of trafficking. Though sometimes we've had many, many cases where, a 17-year-old or 16-year-old who actually, can work, never gets paid and keeps working for months with promise of future pay and then is never paid. Another sign is if a young person has had their documents confiscated, particularly for foreign-born, if they have any birth certificates or any passports or anything like that, that could be a sign. And another thing we see, what I mentioned before, is just the youth is always tired because they're working all the time. So we want to move to, if you suspect that a child or youth is being trafficked, what questions could you ask them to assess if they might be a survivor? So Tina, can you talk a little bit about specific questions that would be important to ask when it comes to the 4 different types of sex trafficking?
Yes. Well, so remember in the beginning we touched on those 4 domestic sex trafficking situations: pimp, gang, family, boys, and / transgender, right? Each of these, I told you, has a different way to enter and a different question that might be asked. I think that's sorry about that. I think that's important because I want to kind of talk about our basic questions that we ask everybody. In the beginning, I told you that at Courtney's house, we don't use the term running away. And the reason why we don't use the term running away is because that's also a charge in many of our areas, including our area. A charge would be abscondence. So kids are held on abscondence, which is running away, which means you won't get the full story because they'll think they'll be in trouble. So some of the things we ask, and these are basic questions along with pimp control. Have you ever left home? Just think about that for a moment, because you don't have to say, have you ever ran away? Have you ever left home? And then they tell us when they left home, what made you leave home? These sound very simple, but it gives you so many more answers. How many times did you leave home? What are some of the ways you took care of yourself? Think about that. How can a 12-year-old, 13-year-old take care of themselves when they left home? And they'll walk you through that. Did you ever do any traveling while you were gone? So instead of asking about leaving out of state, where we just ask traveling, and then we just ask about what the places did you go when you were gone? And they normally tell us this information. So just think about asking questions in a different way. So those were the basic questions we asked everyone. And then specifically, while traveling, who did you go with? How long were you gone when you traveled? While you're away from home, did anybody keep you from coming back? Did anyone introduce you to stripping? If so, where did you strip? Did you ever go to any shopping malls while you were gone? Now, let me explain why I asked some of these questions quickly. The stripping is important because 98% of all our kids stripped, even at 12, 13. Then that will help you understand the places that traffickers have connections inside the strip clubs too. Because remember, it doesn't mean that they're just online, but they have to be forced to work everywhere. The shopping malls is important because survivors' memories, like we don't remember everything by we took a left on Reeve Street, two left. We have to be visual people. We're very visual. And because of that, we will remember if the trafficker went shopping. That's actually a very important question later on for cases. It's important because most of the time we didn't have the money. We did not go pick out our clothes, and the trafficker is the one that handed the money to the salesperson. That's important to build a case because there are cameras inside of malls and stores to prove that he was the one. So just think about that on the way that we ask our questions and that how our questions are really survivor informed. Our next gang question would be, you have to understand the gangs to work with a gang population. You actually have to understand how it happens. One of the main ways is a skip party. Skip parties are actually done in the daytime, and they set up the survivors for sexual assault too, and then also to get into the gangs. How did you hear about the skip parties? They're usually advertised online, on Snapchat, on IG. Were you asked to bring any friends? Sometimes kids think, and I think we did as youth thought, that if we were 15, 16, going to a party, if we brought one of our friends that was the same exact age, we would be safe. Well, at the parties run by gang members, they encourage you to bring friends. Did anyone ever show you a DVD or YouTube footage? A lot of the gangs actually film even their murders and when they assault people. And a lot of our survivors saw these before. And that's because gang members show these videos to intimidate them as well. And then you have to understand what the difference between a clique and a set is. Survivors who are in a gang, and I'm going to say that 100% of every girl we've ever worked with in a gang was not in there by choice. It was 100% trafficking. And I say that because none of them know how you move up in a gang. They don't understand their gang sets. They don't know the rules of the gang. And they could never become captain or lieutenant. And that's important because that means that they're being sold. The next piece of that, right, is family control. How do we know that it's a family, especially inside of care? A child being in a foster care or many people reporting the child, how do you know? Well, when you're in a family control situation, even at 9, 10, families say that you have to put all your money together and everybody works in a family. That's if you're raking leaves, if you're mowing the lawn, or anything they ask you to do. So have you ever helped your family save money? That's very important because how did the child help save the money? What are some of the ways that you helped? Has anyone in your family ever dropped you off at someone's house? You know, Allie mentioned labor trafficking and sex trafficking and their overlap. This is very important because when you buy someone, it doesn't mean that you just can have sex with them, but you force them to do anything you want them to do. And it could be cleaning, it could be having sex, but usually they drop them off for a certain time span. And the family is the one who's arranging all of this. So we asked, how long were you gone? Did you go to someone else's house or did they come inside that house? So just remembering, and like I said, really understanding your dynamics of control helps better understand how to help the survivor. For boys as well, it can be, did anyone ever give you hormone shots? Maybe I'm promising them hormone shots and saying that, hey, if you do this, I can help you get this. And you can get it at 12 and 13 where maybe it might be illegal. Did you have a mama? So think about this for a moment. Most of our boys who lived in a house, and you do not have to be transgender to live in a house. It's a house of diva, house of love. The house is always named. When it's named, you have mamas there, grandmamas, right? So very close to a pimp control situation, the dynamic of control. The thing is, you may keep some money, but you pay bills every day. So every day you pay rent, every day you pay lights. So who helped you become fearless? That's another terminology of becoming fearless is being in the life. Were you in any dance crews? Again, some of our survivors were recruited by joining dance crews. that were not real dance crews, and that was their trafficking situation. And I'm seeing a lot of chat lines coming back. And I know that many people think the online, but we have seen a huge change on chat lines. And that's because it's harder for police to get a warrant to a chat line. Chat lines are easier. You literally get on the phone and start yelling how old they're looking for a child who's 12 or 13, and you kind of yell and get your number out there so they can quickly write it down and then contact you. Thank you guys so much. Allie?
Thanks. So now we're going to take a look at who may encounter trafficked children and youth. And this has really changed over the years. Really, anyone can identify a trafficked child or youth. We've had cases where literally a next-door neighbor saw a 12-year-old coming out in the middle of the night to put garbage into a garbage can, but yet that child never went to school. They never saw that child at any other time, and they called the police, and that kind of tipped things off. So it could be, a neighbor. It could really be anyone. But here are some of the groups that are very well positioned to identify trafficked children and youth. So school staff, again, if kids are missing a lot of school, or if they're sleeping, or if there's been a change in the way that they perform at school. If they were good students and suddenly they're failing everything, that could be, something that that would indicate that there is trafficking. Social service providers, of course, could potentially see these kids or have them in their existing programs. Some kids, particularly kids that are in care, that live in group home or residential treatment facilities, they may already be in other types of programs for other things going on in their lives. Faith-based organizations are really well positioned to encounter these kids. Healthcare providers, there's been increasing evidence that one of the few places a trafficker will actually take their victims is to a clinic or a hospital. And remember, because if the person becomes sick or is injured, then they can't work or they can't be as easily trafficked out. So that would be somewhere that they will be taken and identified more and more. Legal services, many of these kids have other issues going on in their lives where maybe they have an attorney or maybe they're involved with a custody suit or something like that. Runaway homeless youth service providers, like Tina was saying, we don't want to say that they're runaway, but many of them may end up with nowhere to go or being on the streets, so they may show up in shelters. Department of Social Services, Child Protective Services. We in New York see a lot of kids through foster care and Child Protective Services. Law enforcement's also well positioned to encounter these youth. What we see with law enforcement is that the kids may be committing other crimes because of their trafficking situation. So maybe they're not being fed, so they go into a store and steal food. Or maybe their trafficker is forcing them to commit some crime like stealing something or stealing a car or carrying drugs. So when we train police, we often train them to look even at other crimes that kids have committed and look beyond that and see if there's some sort of reason why they're committing that crime. Tina, do you want to add anything to this slide?
No, I can say that a lot of our referrals do come from schools, also parents, good parents who have been actively looking for their kids as well. So let's not forget the good parents and resources for them who've been actively looking for their children.
Great, thanks. So now we're going to move and talk about what are the social service needs of survivors. And under our federal trafficking law, the TVPA, it's based on 3 Ps. And one of the Ps is looking at protection in terms of services. So in the United States, survivors of trafficking are entitled to a whole list of services, many of them which are up on this slide. So developing a working relationship with local agencies who can provide different services is really important because most agencies don't provide comprehensive services that youth need. Youth may have very many needs that range from mental health services to health needs to mental health needs, to housing, to translation, education. So it's really important for those of you who might identify these youth to know in advance what organizations you trust and develop relationships with these groups. And that's where joining some of the local task forces can be really helpful, so that if you do have cases of trafficking, you know where to refer the young people for these different kinds of services. So child and youth serving professionals should first consider the particular expertise of the other agencies in the community and make sure that they also have staff trained on the special needs of trafficked persons. We want to make sure that they're competent and that they have experience working with vulnerable children and youth in a trauma-informed way, and making sure that they have the expertise that will meet the needs of the children and youth. So this slide just provides more services that young people may need. It's important that they really get comprehensive services as part of their care, and developing these working relationships with local agencies who provide these services will really help you in the referral process. We could really do an entire training on the specialized service needs of these young people, but today we're really just kind of giving you an overview of the types of services they need, because we want the children to feel comfortable. And so even though there may be somebody who provides translation services, as an example, in your community, if they're not trained on child trafficking and they don't know the crime and they don't know the sensitivities and the special needs of these kids, they may not be successful in providing those services. So it's really important to work with partners who are well-trained in the issue of child trafficking, because we really don't want to cause more harm to the youth. And sometimes, and I'm sure you can talk a little bit about this, Tina, but it could be our only shot with a young person. If they get before one of our agencies or come in for one of our services, you know, it may be months before they can get out and get in front of somebody else who could potentially help them.
Yes.
Did I go too far here? So looking at when is a referral in the best interest of a youth. So once you identify needs that your agency cannot meet or would be better met through specialized service provision elsewhere, you want to look to find trauma-informed, culturally appropriate services by reaching out to local anti-trafficking task forces and coalitions who provide these services to survivors of child trafficking or CSEC. You can ask for new contacts for details about their service options. You can contact the provider in the presence of the youth so that he or she can ask questions and make sure that they're going to feel comfortable. You want to discuss each referral option with the child or youth and weigh each option with the youth, giving consideration to any potential risk to safety. So, for example, if a particular service provider is in a neighborhood where the youth might run into the trafficker, it might not be a good idea to use that service provider, as an example. You want to establish contact with a representative from the agency that's chosen by the youth, who has familiarity with trauma and with child trafficking or CSEC, and provide information on the youth's needs, any special considerations in relation to the trauma they have experienced, and any paperwork that the service provider might require. So what I'm really saying is you don't want to just hand the kid a card with a phone number on it and say, here, you know, this is a dental office. You know, you really want to help them bridge the gap between working with you and other service providers. Hopefully, if they're working with you, that means that they're putting some trust in you and you're developing a relationship with them. So if you can help bridge that gap and build that relationship with the other providers, then that's really in the best interest of the youth. Often, we advise people to visit the agency with your client before you even arrange the services. This is called a warm handoff, just so that they feel comfortable, they know where to go, they know where the building is, they know how to get in. And then you could really ask youth if they want to be escorted to future appointments, if they want, you know, someone to come with them, or if they prefer to go on their own. Tina, would you like to add anything else about service provision for young people?
Yeah, so we do a lot of more emergency, meaning that maybe we come to them. Maybe if they return from foster care, we come to the foster care agency right away, the police station. They never have handcuffs on. They're in a different room. They're not in the booking room. The police leave the room so we can talk to them. So just thinking that sometimes it would be great that if every kid comes to our drop-in center, but we actually screen people first and see if they want to be a part of us before they go there. So also making sure that transportation is arranged. If they say yes and they're ready to go, how are you going to make sure that they get there? Is that giving them a token or a car, metro card to get on the metro, performing rides from foster care, getting the van, just remembering these pieces. Now, the one thing I will add, for our referral form is very different at Courtney's house. The first page is for the person referring the child. The second page is for the youth. And I think that's important to have something for them that can explain who you are better in your own words, your organization own words, and who you are so that they also know. We also have videos on our Instagram, Snapchat for youth. Like you can follow us, and that's very different for them so they can see fun things that we do.
Great. Thanks, Tina. And now I'd like to turn it over to Hema to talk a little bit about the legal remedies that are available to survivors of trafficking.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm just going to cover, this is going to be a very broad overview of some of the options that are available. And I actually want to start with sort of our model of legal intake. Let me get to this slide here. So we at the Victim Rights Law Center believe in a holistic or comprehensive model of doing legal representation with any survivor, always placing the needs and choices of the survivor at the center of any decision making. So as you can see from this framework, when we begin to work with a survivor, we call this sort of our mind map in some ways of beginning to think about the ways in which a survivor's experiences might impact their needs around issues of safety, privacy, mental health, financial issues, immigration, education, employment, housing, and criminal law. And as you can see, it's a common response that we get, from the general public, a response to assessing the needs of survivors. Oftentimes people jump to criminal issues as the primary focus. We think of this as one small component to a number of forms of remedies and issues that a survivor might express a need for support around. So I just wanted to start there. I want to take a look. I'm going to flip around a tiny bit because I wanted to tie together some of the conversations that we've been having for the past hour or so. A lot of folks who are newer to this topic of today's webinar, are newer to representing minors, right? So some common questions and concerns that come up in our work are, as seen on the slide, can you provide services without parental consent? What does parental notice mean? In our office, we will always consider a minor to be our primary client, and it's really a process of negotiating with the survivor and the family, to what extent is the survivor's, that minor child's experiences and privacy protected, and we put the survivor's needs first as much as we can. There are questions that vary enormously by state law. If the parent wants information, do you have to provide it? What if a parent is a perpetrator? What happens in those kinds of scenarios? What happens if a parent asks for a minor's medical records? Can a minor even sign a release of information or consent to having their information released? So, I wish I had concrete answers for all of you on these, but I do believe that, these are sort of a foundation of some questions to begin to consider as your organization develops policies and practices and best practices around working with minors. And again, I think the wisdom of, all of you on this webinar is, the experiences of working with survivors can directly impact, how we approach our organizational policies and structures as we, contemplate working increasingly with survivors and commercially trafficked minors. Okay. One of the primary areas that Victim Rights Law Center, obviously works with when we're working with survivors is, thinking about physical safety. Oftentimes the term safety planning is something that's used quite frequently in a domestic violence context. Given that we work primarily with non-intimate partners, survivors of sexual assault, we still do safety planning with survivors. It just looks a little bit different for those of you who may be more familiar to safety planning in a domestic violence context. As we heard earlier, there are certainly a lot of parallels in terms of some of the dynamics of power and control at play when working with commercially sexually exploited children. Okay. One method that we have come up with in terms of just helping a survivor assess their safety concerns, especially for a survivor who might be feeling, entirely overwhelmed. Their life may feel completely turned upside down, and as we mentioned earlier, their needs are manyfold, right? From concerns about education to privacy to safety, sometimes it's hard to know where to start. So one method that we use in safety planning with survivors is to really walk them through their day. So sort of from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep, who are you talking to? What kinds of social media sites might you use? Where do you like to post? Where do you feel safer? Where are your points of feeling safer? Where are your points of feeling more vulnerable? And again, every assessment of what sort of safety provisions to put into place along the way is going to be entirely context dependent, right? What works for one survivor may be unsafe for another. So, really understanding the context in which you are operating is critical. And I think, again, borrowing from the wisdom of folks on this webinar will be enormously helpful to tailor our safety planning for this particular population in more nuanced ways. Again, safety planning is never a one-time event. It's always a process. And again, we really subscribe to it's survivor-led at all times. We do have a tool that is being developed on LGBTQ survivor-specific safety planning, as well as a safety planning tool for folks experiencing homelessness. And those two tools are sort of just a chart, a guide for advocates and attorneys to, walk survivors through some of those aspects of their day to map out, what might feel safer, what feels less safe. And I think all of these tools can be very useful, again, when we're talking about individuals where, turning to the criminal justice system might not be the safest initial option. It might not be something that survivor wants to engage in at this time. Okay. I want to touch on privacy, partly because safety and privacy are often extremely connected. So in terms of privacy issues, our role is to help survivors go into every decision and conversation sort of eyes wide open. What we can do practically when we're working with a survivor in assessing their privacy needs is, trying to get to the bottom of, again, kind of through a mapping process, what information would that survivor want to keep private, and where is that information held? So we do things like sending letters to providers, other social services providers, putting them on notice that the survivor does not consent to release certain pieces of information. In criminal cases, we in Massachusetts have standing at a particular point in the case where a defendant might be trying to bring in confidential information about the survivor, like medical or social services records, into the criminal case. We work with some survivors who are interested in working with the media, and this is also a context where we can help survivors identify privacy concerns when they are accessing or utilizing the media to either share their story or engage about the issue. Kind of talking through with survivors, what's it going to be like if this pops up on Google later. And again, we never make decisions for survivors. It's more about just informing survivors about what some of the possible outcomes might be. Another piece is I think it's important for all of us providers to be aware of the importance of staying on top of our social media awareness. A lot of us, some of us do better than others, and I still don't have an Instagram account, and I've convinced myself I need to do that, and I know that I'm out of date already with that. But younger survivors are often are going to be, again, using social media, and we need to know what some of the privacy concerns and access issues exist in whatever social media platform we're talking about. One interesting tip that a colleague of mine shared with me, when we're working with whole families, sometimes younger survivors actually know how to protect their information better than other family members, right? So, for example, a younger survivor might know exactly how to block certain individuals from accessing their information. Their next of kin, maybe a parent who is involved, might not have that same awareness. So really kind of extending the education, beyond that individual to other family members if that's relevant to the situation. Okay, I'm going to just briefly touch on education. I know we have a lot of material to cover, so I want to leave some time for our case scenarios. We do have an entire webinar on education concerns for minors who are survivors of sexual assault. So we're happy to be a resource and share that. There are a number of education rights to explore. The big issue, this is a huge issue since the vast majority of survivors are between the ages of 12 and 24. They have an enormous amount of educational considerations that might come up. The assault can directly impact the access a survivor has to education. So, I would like to just flag some of the forms of relief that do exist. Obviously, we know that Title IX is a big issue right now, and it's certainly a bulk of our practice here. But if folks have additional questions on kind of connecting the educational rights piece to this population, it would be great to hear from you, and we're happy to provide some technical assistance and point you in the right direction. Okay. Finally, very briefly, my practice area, I'm an immigration attorney, and for immigrant survivors, especially in this climate, concerns around immigration status are, a source of immense concern and anxiety. So there are two primary forms of relief available for immigrant survivors. There's a U visa and the T visa. U visas are for those who have suffered substantial physical or mental abuse from certain criminal activities. That crime had to occur in the U.S. or otherwise violate a U.S. law. And the hook is sort of that you have to provide law enforcement you have to be helpful in the investigation or prosecution of a law enforcement process. And the criteria is, did that individual suffer substantial physical or mental harm? And do they possess information about the criminal activity that happened? So similarly, the T visa is for victims of severe trafficking, which we defined earlier under federal law. The applicant has to be physically present in the U.S. on account of that trafficking. And there's a lot of conversation around what those words mean. What does on account mean? Again, this survivor has to be helpful, comply with reasonable requests for assistance in the investigation of the Trafficking Act, except if you're under 18, certification is not required. And the test in terms of eligibility for T visa relief is whether you would suffer extreme hardship, some kind of severe, unusual harm if you were removed from the U.S. And, for many survivors who have experienced significant trauma and maybe connected to or have the possibility of being connected to services, that kind of having the opportunity to access those forms of relief can be enormously helpful, and obviously the denial of those forms of relief can cause hardship. So I'm going to leave us there and turn it back over to all of you to continue with some of our case scenarios. But I do want to leave us as a resource. Feel free to reach out with any specific questions about legal options.
Thank you, Hama. I really appreciate it. Thank you. So before we get into the case studies, we have one more true-false question, just to make sure everybody's on their toes, as we've been on the phone now for more than an hour. So the question is, minors who provide sex acts in exchange for money, goods, a place to stay, etc., are they considered victims of trafficking? True or false? Give everybody a minute to get their answer in. All right, very good. True. The answer is true. Any minor who engages in commercial sex is considered a victim or survivor of sex trafficking, regardless of if there is a third party involved and regardless if the youth considers him or himself a victim. Great. Now I'm going to turn it over to Tina to run through quickly a few case studies, because I really think that hearing real examples and trying to figure out what's going on and whether or not it's trafficking is the most useful for all of you who work in service provision or provide legal services or youth services to young people. So with that, I will turn it over to Tina.
Right. So let's see if we think this is sex trafficking and what are some red flags. You are talking with Justin, a bright 15-year-old boy. Justin says he recently was kicked out of his home after his parents found explicit texts and photos on his phone shared with a male classmate. When asked where he lives, he says he couch surfs. He has been going out on some dates with older men who take him to dinner and let him stay over sometimes. He says he doesn't always like to do it, but it's been cold lately. He's heard from other boys like him that there's a woman who lets them all stay at her place for free, doing basically the same thing, so he might check it out. So, do we think that this could be sex trafficking? And if we do think that, when we're pointing it out, what are the red flags in this scenario? So let's take a look at that and see. So now we're saying that I'm gonna give you a moment just to kind of think about that on your own. And we're gonna go to a different case study on that as well so we can come back.
Tina, you're sounding pretty quiet. Can you move closer to your mic?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can everyone hear me now?
Wonderful.
Okay, sorry. I accidentally turned that down. So let's go on this. I just want to remind everyone, we've all heard of a term called survival sex. But we know that any man who has sex with a child, that is not survival sex, right? That's survival rape, because that's a grown man having sex with a child. So just think about that in your scenarios that we'll go back to. Case study 2. Let's see if this could be sex trafficking and why. Monica is a 16-year-old African-American female. She's in the custody of both her biological parents and has one older brother. She was charged with abscondence and truancy and was placed on probation. While on probation, she ran away from home more than 10 times and was placed at an out-of-state lockdown facility. Monica never learned about consensual sex. She was sexually assaulted at the age of 12 by her biological brother, and his abuse continued until she was 15. Monica's parents refuse to discuss her abuse. They say they have moved on, and so could she. Monica feels her parents are not listening to her, and she rebels. It is difficult for her to see that this is wrong for adult men to solicit sex from a minor. Monica has ads online sites like Backpages. She tells social workers that she goes to hotels and motels to give massages, and she doesn't have sex. Monica says she is doing it on her own. After being home for about 2 months, she has left home again, but has since returned. She is now receiving long-term case management from a direct service provider. Now, I want to kind of go back while you're thinking about this and go back to our red flags of Justin. So we see this a lot with our population, but remember they mentioned also a house. These were adult men that was buying sex. So usually our boys have more mental health concerns because this consensual sex and survival sex confuses them into thinking that they never experience any type of sexual abuse. Inside these homes, although they can keep a small amount of money, it is a controlled setting where they pay every day for utilities and bills. And if they don't want to do it anymore, they actually are free to go, except that nobody that was in any of the houses are allowed to talk to them. So just think about that a moment for your answers. Monica, in her situation, she was sexually abused at a very young age by her biological brother, who still resides inside the home. With maybe parents do not want to talk about this, or they say they're going to separate them, so she wouldn't be along with her brother. Let's think about if she ever even understood what consensual sex was. Who even taught her to go online to Backpages? How did she just wake up and learn about this all by herself? Or was it other friends that showed her and then she continued on? What's important for everyone to understand is that everybody has different needs and places that they are mentally, right? They're all on different mental levels. So understanding what consensual sex is and your body is a choice to do something might be a step that you all have to talk with them about. Now let's go on to, can you identify the types of control that are exhibited in this case? Let's think about this as we go on. Starting at age 13, Darnell, an African-American male, was trafficked by his mother. Suffering from a heroin addiction, Darnell's mom sold him for sex in exchange for money and drugs. Darnell, LGBTQ youth, who was sold on the streets of Washington, D.C. for 5 years. Darnell only knew that his family needed money, and he felt responsible for pitching in and bringing money into the family. If Darnell didn't do as he was told, he was ignored by his entire family and was not allowed to eat with the rest of the siblings. At age 16, Darnell was placed in foster care. He continued to work because he was only taught to sell his body for sex to make money. After being out on the street, Darnell met a man 15 years older than him. And he told him that he'd look out for him and made sure that he was safe. This man later became Darnell's boyfriend. In exchange for providing food and clothing, Darnell must turn over his money to his new boyfriend. His boyfriend tells Darnell that he keeps his money to make sure it's stored in a safe place. So just remembering that each situation is different, and that means the way that you're going to have to work with the youth to see their situation is going to be different, and the way that they perceive the information is going to. Darnell, I said, identifies as a gay male, not trans. So we need to understand the LGBT community too, and then also understand how different people may define as, and not putting our perception into how they define. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Tina.
You're welcome.
So remember, it's unlikely that a child will disclose right away. It often takes time and sometimes a lot of time to build the trust and rapport with a child or youth so that they will feel comfortable disclosing. And I know sometimes we suspect, and we may even have evidence that there's trafficking going on long before a child will disclose. So there are things that you can do if you do suspect that a child or youth is being trafficked. We want to end by making sure you know what to do and where to call and how to get the resources that you need if you come into this situation. So we learned from the, I'm on the wrong slide, sorry about that. So if a youth discloses sex trafficking situation to you, if they're in immediate danger, you need to call 911 if their life is in danger. If they reside with their trafficker, it's important to develop a safety plan. Again, like domestic violence, it's very rare that a young person will leave their trafficker after one time. Do you want to talk briefly about that, Tina, what you see in terms of a young person going back and forth with their trafficker due to the trauma bonding?
So I think you got to understand that, it takes a long time to get out the life of all these other issues and things that you had going on before your trafficking situation. Each one of those forms of trafficking looks different to survivors of sex trafficking too, just like it looks different to you. So that means 100% of the time we get in a different trafficking situation, or we go back to a different trafficker. So maybe you go back and now you're with a different trafficker thinking that our response will be different than when it was before. That's very common with any cycle of abuse, of not understanding that and seeing it ourselves. So just know that. I like to prepare survivors for good and bad so they understand. If they feel too guilty about going back, they won't call you and they won't tell anyone because they'll feel embarrassed again, and you don't want them to feel that way.
That's right. Thank you, Tina. It's also really important to think about what their immediate needs are. I mean, if you have somebody who, is coming into meeting with you and they can barely keep their eyes open, maybe letting them lay down and take a short nap is going to be a great way to build rapport and to build trust and to give that young person what they need at that time. If they're not having food, if they have medical needs like a toothache or something that's really, really bothering them, they don't have a place to sleep, no amount of counseling is going to help them with the trafficking situation. So you really need to look at what are their immediate needs, like food, water, safety, medical needs, housing. If you're a mandated reporter, you just have to follow the protocol in your state if it is a minor, and many of those protocols are, vary. And whatever you do, you want to employ that trauma-informed, strengths-based approach that Hema talked about before. And you want to always incorporate the survivor in any kind of planning, case planning, safety planning, anything. You want to have them be a partner. And you really need to respect their decisions as well, or they won't work with you. They won't come back. Really focusing on meeting the needs of the youth and where they are at that particular time is really important if they disclose to you. So this may sound a little funny, but, in many programs, the workers are not used to working with commercially sexually exploited youth. And the young people may share with them what's going on, and if you're not trained or if you haven't worked with these kids, or maybe you've only worked with a couple of these kids, they might tell you things or share with you things that they've had to do or that's happened that may shock you or disgust you, and obviously you have to refrain from showing that. You really need to be able to be in a place where you can handle whatever it is that they're sharing with you. You need to convey to them that it's not their fault and you believe them. That's really important in terms of building that relationship of trust. And you have to respect that the youth may still be in love and desire a relationship with their trafficker. Those trauma bonds are so strong, and it may take time for those bonds to break. And also, it's really important to consider a multidisciplinary response. If any of you have worked with child advocacy centers, CACs, that approach is highly recommended and has been pretty successful. And you have to make sure that you understand what your role is as a mandated reporter. Here are some resources and some services that are available to victims and survivors of all forms of trafficking. Each program has its own eligibility requirements, but this is a great place to start if you're not part of a task force or you need some specific information. But as I mentioned before, being part of a task force, even if you're not a primary organization that only serves survivors of trafficking, if you work with vulnerable youth or exploited youth in any way, it's really helpful to get hooked up with either a safe harbor task force or one of the federal, more comprehensive human trafficking task forces. This is the National Human Trafficking Hotline run by Polaris, and it's really important to call this if you suspect trafficking for a couple of reasons. One, they're connected to a network of service providers and law enforcement across the country in a specific area, but it's also important that we collect data if we suspect that there is trafficking going on, because there's really not enough resources to assist kids who've been trafficked, and keeping this data and showing the number of cases and where they are geographically is really important. The operators at this hotline are not associated with law enforcement, but they can connect a caller to law enforcement if that's what they would like. So we have just a few minutes. If anyone has any questions for any of us today, we'd be happy to answer if we can. Or if you think of questions or you have identify someone going forward, we're always here for you as the OVW training and technical assistance providers. You can reach out to us at any time, and we'd be happy to see what we can do to try to advise you and help you with whatever situation you're facing. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type it, right into the chat. Don't all speak up at once. All right, well, if no one has any questions, I just want to thank everyone for being on this presentation today, and we hope and expect that this will just be the first webinar on the issue of sex trafficking and child trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation of children, and that in the future we'll be offering some more concrete and specialized trainings on this issue. But again, please feel free. Our emails are all up here. If you have any specific questions that you want to ask us, please do not hesitate to get in touch. And thanks again to Hama and to Tina for being part of the webinar today. And thank you to Alicia for your role in...
Becky, you had a... I'm sorry, Becky had a great question, Allie. She wanted to know if she can get a copy of the PowerPoint. Will it be available?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. For some reason, I'm not seeing the questions. Thanks, Tina. Yes, we will make this presentation available, I think, in a PDF form.
The PDF form is actually available just below the chat box and the files box. If you click on it and click download files, you'll be able to download the PDF version.
Great. Are there any other questions? Because I'm, for some reason, not seeing them if they're coming up.
I do not see any more questions.
I believe that Marta is typing her question.
We've got a couple more people typing.
Okay, great. Where would I see this, Alicia? Because I'm not seeing it.
You should be able to see it to the right of the power.
Marta and Wendy and Haley, thank you guys for being there. I'm glad it was an informative one. Thank you guys for this. Remember, we're all available later just to help you guys, okay? And no, there are no such thing as dumb questions. So just ask away and we'll be there to help you guys.
Thanks, everybody. This was great.
Thank you. And there is a short evaluation at the end of this. If you could please fill it out, that would be terrific.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to close out now, but we'll leave it open just a minute longer to let anyone type in any other questions. Yes, again, the materials are in the files box just below the chat box, but we will also email them out right after today's webinar. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.